Alright guys, so we're going to go ahead and get started on our second part of this forensic toxicology chapter. So today we're going to look at some of the types of drugs and how they relate into crimes. We're also going to get into some drug charges and kind of look at how numerous and kind of what a problem drugs are in our country today. So remember, when we're talking about drugs, drugs is kind of a very broad term that can imply that there are lots of different things underneath this umbrella term of drugs. So some drugs are perfectly normal and legal and prescribed to you by a doctor, and it's perfectly fine. Some drugs are not prescribed to you by a doctor and produce other kind of major side effects. So kind of two classifications here. With your illegal drugs, illegal drugs, obviously we know they are bad by this time in your life, but they are defined as drugs that have no current accepted medical use in the United States. So they still can produce different side effects, different highs, but from a medical standpoint, there's no real reason for them. They don't help fix anything. They don't help cure or treat anything in that human body. So examples, these are just two examples. There's lots of other ones, which we'll get into later, but two examples that you probably have heard about. So heroin and LSD. And then we have drugs that also can cause some major side effects to the human body, but they do have a beneficial medical aspect to them. So another kind of category of drugs are controlled substances. So these are legal drugs where sale, possession, and multi-use are restricted but still legal. And the reason why they're restricted is because they have mind-altering effects and they have the potential to be abused. So prescribed narcotics, also some depressants and stimulants fall under this as well. So controlled substances have the potential to lead into drug abuse and addiction as well, but with controlled substances, there's actually some medical benefits to them. So that's why they're controlled. They just have to be careful with what they prescribe, how much they prescribe, so on and so forth. Now we're getting into some of this, and I'm going to take you to a different website because this is a little outdated here. But when we look across the United States as a whole, drug abuse violations and drug charges are always near the top of the list. They're usually in at least the top 8 of all charges, which, considering the amount of charges there are out there, is actually pretty high. They do fluctuate from year to year, so sometimes they're the 6th highest, sometimes they're the 7th, but they're usually always in that top 8. If you look across the prison systems today, the majority, over half of the prison population, will have drug charges, or drug abuse violations, and sometimes those are with other charges as well. And what we see is that over 25% of your domestic violence disputes are going to be drug-related in some way, shape, or form. And 81% of child endangerment cases are also drug-related. So what child endangerment means, if someone is, it doesn't always necessarily mean child abuse. It can, but it doesn't always necessarily mean child abuse. Child endangerment, an example of that would be if there was a child in the house that people were selling drugs out of. So if someone was dealing drugs in their residence and they happened to have their child there with them, that is considered child endangerment at that point, and the child would most often be taken away from those parents until they figure out charges and whether or not that child needs to go into the foster care system or not. So a lot of those child endangerment cases are going to be related into the selling and possession of those drugs too. Alright, so what I'm taking you to next, so this website right here is one that's run through our FBI unit, and it kind of summarizes all of the crimes in the United States. Now, I know this one is 2018. 2018 was just finalized a couple months ago. 2019, they have their preliminary reports out, but with 2019 only being a couple months ago, a lot of the cases are still being finalized. So they don't actually have a concrete number of cases from 2019, and definitely not from 2020 because we're not even halfway through that yet. So a lot of times with these reports, they're usually like a year behind, okay, just because with the court systems, it does take time to get everything finalized, okay. So one thing that I kind of wanted to show you here, this one isn't as nicely put together as the one that I found on my PowerPoint slide, but if you look through here, obviously pretty big numbers, but we are looking across the United States, okay, definitely in the thousands and hundreds of thousands. But when we scroll down to where we look at drug abuse violations, okay, it's going to be one of our top scores here with 1,654,282, okay, cases in the 2018 year, which was just a couple years ago. If you look across, okay, there are not that many more, okay. There's a couple catch-all categories where they don't fit into them. That's where that big one is, okay? But the other categories that are kind of within the realm of that 1 million mark, so driving under the influence, okay, with the effects of alcohol or drugs, so really drug abuse violation and driving under the influence, a lot of times people will get both charges depending on whether or not they were operating a motor vehicle at that time. Other parts here, if we're looking just statistically, okay, we've got other assaults and property crime, okay, up there as well, and the others do not reach quite that 1 million mark. So other assaults versus aggravated assault, in case you didn't know, aggravated assault is a charge that people get when they are threatening other people with a deadly weapon, typically a knife or a gun. Okay, so aggravated assault means that there was a weapon, clear weapon of some sort. Other assaults would be like if people got into a fist fight, okay, that would be classified under the other assaults, okay, which is probably why that is so numerous there. Okay, a lot of the drunken disorderly conducts will fall under that. And then property crime, so some of the a lot of times when drunken disorderly conducts, they'll have arsons because they are catching things on fire as well. Okay, so a lot of these is what I'm saying will be tied together because people typically don't get charged with one crime, they're usually charged with several crimes if they were to be going into the court system. Alright, but just giving you a view of what we're looking at least in 2018. Okay, back to this. Alright, so when someone gets charged with drugs of whatever type, okay, there are 5 what they call schedules of classification of controlled substances. So the word schedule is kind of a weird word to use because when we think schedule, we think of like, oh, first period, second period, I do this, then I do that. When they say schedules in the forensics field or in the law field, they're talking more of almost like levels. Okay, so maybe think of it as like 5 levels of classification when it comes down to controlled substances. And so they base these 5 levels that we're going to see on the next slide. They base these 5 levels on the following things. So they'll base it on the drug's potential for abuse, okay, because some drugs will lead more into that ability to abuse them compared to others. Okay, so you're probably not going to abuse your typical Tylenol, Motrin, Advil, okay, but heroin has a much higher potential for abuse. Okay. Potential to physical and psychological dependence, we'll get more into that here. So psychological dependence, down here below all of this, means that people need it mentally. Okay, so whether they have a mental disorder or just some mental conditions, that means that the conditional use of that drug has underlying emotional needs. So think of like antidepressants or antidepressant medication, bipolarism medication taken for schizophrenia. So a lot of those like medical conditions, okay, or mental conditions, those would be the drugs that fall underneath that. So they take that into consideration when they're trying to figure out the levels of charges here. The other one, so potential for physical dependence. So physical dependence is meaning that there's a physiological need for that drug that has been brought about by its regular use. So what happens is over time, as people continue to use a certain drug over and over and over again, that their human body gets used to it. And whenever they try to stop it, they start to show withdrawal symptoms. So sometimes these withdrawal symptoms can be really severe, okay, where they have like major nausea, fever, migraines, and sometimes not so much. So one that like maybe you guys have seen, so like a physical dependence that maybe some of you have, and I know I definitely have, would be to caffeine. Okay, that's one that's pretty common here. And so whenever you have caffeine every day, like me and my coffee, okay, and then all of a sudden you don't get your coffee, or you don't get your energy drink, or whatever your caffeine desire is, okay, once you stop getting that, then oftentimes you feel like that headache come on. And while the withdrawal symptoms are not that severe, your body still notices it's missing, okay. And the last thing they take into effect whenever they're looking at what category they're going to place these drugs is if that drug has any type of medical value into it or not. Okay. All right, so the 5 schedules or levels of controlled substances. So if you look up in the newspaper, or if you look at any like jail or inmate information, because those are public documents, they are all accessible online, it'll say like the person's name, and then it'll say like what charges they have. So sometimes it'll be like so-and-so and so-and-so, and they have a Schedule 1 charge. Okay, so that just means it's a level 1 charge. Now, level 1 charges are a lot more severe than the higher numbers. So it's better to have a higher number than a lower number, which seems a little backwards sometimes. But Schedule 1 drugs, or Schedule 1 charge, means that that person was either possessing or selling or distributing drugs with high potential for abuse and addiction, and drugs that do not have any medical value to them. So heroin, LSD, ecstasy, marijuana are all examples of this. Now some of you might be questioning, like, well, what about medical marijuana? There is a difference between like street marijuana and medical marijuana, which we're going to get into probably in tomorrow's lesson. Yeah, definitely tomorrow's lesson. The next schedule, okay, is schedule number 2. Okay, so this is still pretty severe charges, okay, but not quite as bad as Schedule 1. So Schedule 2, these are going to be people who are charged with possessing, distributing, selling drugs with high potential for abuse and addiction. However, they do have some medical value with restrictions. So a lot of these are controlled substances. PCP, cocaines, amphetamines, some opiates like your prescribed narcotics, and some barbiturates, which is another class of drugs not many people have heard about. They are also typically prescribed by a doctor, but over time, and you've heard of different cases too, as people get used to those drugs, it can lead into being addicted to that drug if they are not careful. And we'll get more into that as well. Schedule 3. So if someone is charged with a Schedule 3, that means that they are possessing drugs with less potential for abuse and addiction. Now, less does not mean none, all right? Just less. And they are currently acceptable for some medical use. So some of the barbiturates, depending on which type of barbiturate you are using, will fall under Schedule 3. Codeine and steroids also will be considered Schedule 3. Now, one thing that should be said here. So if your doctor prescribes steroids to you, okay, or prescribes codeine to you, you are not going to be charged with possessing that because you have a prescription. These are charges where they do not have a prescription and they are getting it or making it by illegal means, okay, meaning that they are not being prescribed by a medical doctor. So don't freak out if you see some of this in your cabinet because you've been prescribed it. All right, so Schedule 4, okay, we're getting like less in charges here. This would be if someone possessed drugs with a low potential for abuse and addiction. However, they are currently acceptable for medical use. Now, once again, this would be somebody who has drugs that were not prescribed to them. Maybe they were prescribed to somebody else, or maybe they were illegally made, but that means that they do not have a prescription for these drugs. Okay, so any of the tranquilizers, so Valium, Xanax, Librium, okay, all fall under that. And we'll go into more of these later on this chapter too. And then Schedule 5 is the least severe case. These are drugs with low potential abuse, medical use, and low potential dependency. A lot of the opiates with non-narcotic ingredients, like your cough syrups, will actually fall under this, but not just your typical cough syrup, but a cough syrup that has been prescribed to you by a doctor. Okay, if it's not prescribed, then that's a charge. Alright, and my time is running out, so I'm going to go ahead and stop there. If you have any questions, send me an email. Have a good one.